Hello, and welcome to the very first virtual IFAR Evening hosted by the International Foundation for Art Research, better known as IFAR. I'm Sharon Flescher, Executive Director. As many of you know, IFAR, a nonprofit educational and research organization dedicated to integrity in the visual arts, has been celebrating its 50th anniversary. Over these 50 years, we've organized many important, timely, and very popular IFAR evenings and conferences. This program is no exception. The pandemic, we are in New York, and the pandemic has put a damper on our in-person programming. So for the immediate future, we will be hosting our programs virtually. Heads up, our next one will be Tuesday, August 18th, on the topic of museum security and theft. Virtual programming does have one advantage. It gives us the chance to welcome more of you, as most of our in-person programs are sold out very quickly. I hope you'll take the time to learn about us and check out our website, ifar.org, to see our educational resources, our services for the public and the art community, and our publications, especially our award-winning IFAR Journal. 219 and 220 mark the 500th anniversary of the death of several of our great artists. This past February, IFAR hosted an IFAR evening commemorating the 500th anniversary of the death of Leonardo da Vinci, with a program featuring Dr. Carmen Baumbach and Kenneth Soner. Tonight, we turn to another of the greats of the high Italian Renaissance, Raffaello Sanzio da Urbino, known as Raphael, who died in Rome 500 years ago this April. You may know that the Quirinale in Rome has organized a once-in-a-lifetime Raphael exhibit commemorating this anniversary. The exhibit opened in Rome in early March, but because of the pandemic, had to close only 3 days later. It reopened on June 2nd and will remain open until the end of August. But alas, Americans, with few exceptions, can't enter Italy right now. So to enlighten us about Raphael, we have invited a wonderful speaker and distinguished art historian and curator, Dr. Linda Wolk-Simon, who is a visiting professor at the Institute of Fine Arts, NYU, and the author of the award-winning publication, Raphael at the Metropolitan, the Colonna Altarpiece. Dr. Wolk-Simon will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll open the programs to your questions. You can write your questions at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. After the talk, we'll get to as many of the questions as we can. So, without further delay, I very proudly present Dr. Linda Wolk-Simon. Linda?
Well, good evening, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. And thank you, Sharon, so much for that lovely introduction, and especially for the invitation to present this lecture on Raphael, which, as you noted, marks the 500th anniversary of his death. And on the screen now, while I make just a few preliminary remarks, is one of his most celebrated paintings, which I'm sure many of you will recognize, the Sistine Madonna, now in Dresden. Births and deaths of major artists are often commemorated by exhibitions and other programs, and Raphael, of course, is no exception, though I have to say his anniversary year has to be one of the most fraught. It's the anniversary year that wasn't, or almost wasn't, because so many of the planned events were interrupted, postponed, or canceled because of the coronavirus pandemic. But the silver lining of the COVID cloud is that the world is not only resuming its celebration of Raphael now with the reopening of the major exhibition in Rome at the Scuderie, but extending it. And a second major exhibition that was scheduled to open this fall at the National Gallery in London has now been postponed until 2022. So maybe Raphael, instead of having 1 year, is getting 3 years of celebration, which I think he duly deserves. My talk tonight is not a survey of Raphael's career or discussion of his art. It's not an art history class, but instead, I really wanted to talk about the artist himself, the third and youngest member, together with Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, of the great triumvirate of the Italian Renaissance. Raphael is always conjoined with them, and not just in art history. I'm showing you on the screen the Ninja Turtles, a rather popular toy and cartoon and merchandise campaign of some years ago, where 3 of the turtles are Michelangelo, Leonardo, and Raphael. They obviously were a little stymied about the 4th. Instead of choosing Titian, who I would have recommended, instead Donatello joins this august group. And yet all 3 of these artists, shown here in imagined portraits, based on known or purported likenesses of them, these are all a little later than the artist's actual lifetimes. Unlike the other 2, Raphael has not crossed over into popular culture. There's no Dan Brown book and no Charlton Heston movie, although you will find these admittedly adorable cherubs on china or throw pillows. Why is this? Well, for one thing, Raphael was deeply influenced by the art of both Leonardo and Michelangelo. He was kind of on the receiving end of that, which might lead to the conclusion, the wrong conclusion, that he was the least innovative or gifted of the 3. He was just incredibly receptive to everything he saw that inspired him, and he absorbed it and transformed it into his own unique idiom. Another part of the answer, I think, lies in Raphael's character. If Leonardo was a kind of mysterious magus with artistic and intellectual powers so sublime that they seemed inspired by God, and Michelangelo possessed such explosive and Herculean power that his artistic creativity too was viewed as superhuman, terrifying and awe-inspiring, Raphael, though acclaimed for his talent from a very early age, was more mainstream, fully at ease in the world he inhabited. He was genial, pleasant, and sociable, popular, and not a drama queen, we might say if we were in high school, lacking the dark and brooding temperament and strange neurotic personality traits that are often associated with artistic genius. This is not to deny or minimize his own staggering creative powers, as I hasten to say again, just to point out that in his case, somewhat unusually, they were joined to a remarkably sociable and graceful personality, which is not what people today expect from their artistic geniuses. But that's seeing him through the lens of a modern sensibility. Prior to the 20th century, it was Raphael, not Leonardo, and not Michelangelo, who was the most revered artist of the Western canon. And it was his art that shaped the course of painting for over 300 years, beginning really from the moment of his death. Raphael died shortly after 10 p.m. on April 6, Good Friday, 1520. And I'm showing you now a deathbed scene, Raphael on his deathbed, surrounded by his pupils and the Pope, as imagined by a 19th century French painter. So given that his passing occurred on Good Friday, you can imagine the anagogical significance of that date was played up and seized on by commentators at the time, and all of Rome mourned, according to many of them. Many of the stricken observers reporting on his death from the papal court commented on the magnitude of the grief that gripped the city. And with a little chronological license, a couple of them even said that just as at Christ's crucifixion, which happened on Good Friday, when the heavens wanted to will a sign of profound grief, the walls of the Vatican Palace ruptured, crumbled, cracked at his passing. In fact, the walls of the Vatican Palace did crack and crumble a bit. It happened a few days before he died, but it makes for a good story if we can link it to the moment of his death and make him even more Christ-like. The Christological analogy was reinforced by the funerary tableau staged after his death, when his body was laid out on a bier beneath his final painting. We're told about this, the Transfiguration. Emerging from the darkness like an apparition, the radiant Christ, transcendent in an explosion of divine light, must have struck mourners as a symbolic portrayal of the artist himself, as many scholars have noted. Raphael, whose Christ-like features had been commented on even in his own lifetime. Obviously, this is not a portrait or a self-portrait of Raphael, but imagine in the flickering darkness to mourners subsumed in their grief at his unexpected and sudden passing at the young age of 37, what this might have looked like. Then, in accordance with his wishes, Raphael's earthly remains, borne by in a retinue accompanied by 100 painters bearing torches, a document that my friend and colleague Sharon discovered some years ago, and she's watching today from Chicago, I think. Then his remains were interred in a tomb in the Pantheon. For centuries, a consecrated church, but of course, originally a temple to the pagan gods of ancient Rome. Here, a view into the Pantheon. You're kind of coming in the door. I'm sure many of you watching have been in this extraordinary space, and Raphael's tomb is just up to the left. And you see on the right a detail of the sculpture of this tomb and a fantastic view. It's quite hard to see, but here in the center is a close-up sculpture of the Madonna and Child executed by one of his beloved disciples, the sculptor Lorenzetto. There was no more symbolically resonant space in Rome, and his burial there fueled the nascent hagiography of the Prince of Painters. This is, of course, the familiar epithet that Raphael has been known by really since the time of his life. It was an epithet conferred on him by one of his contemporaries before he even died. In the centuries after his death, the cult of Raphael grew, promoted in academies across Europe and championed by devout adherents like Ang, who really was a Raphael worshiper. It's not surprising then that the opening of his tomb in September 1833 was greeted with the heightened anticipation and solemn ceremony usually reserved for the exhumation of a saint. All Rome talked of nothing else, according to those who witnessed the events. And just as for a blockbuster exhibition, tickets were issued for viewing Raphael's skeleton in the Pantheon. In the course of the few days it was displayed in a glass case before being reinterred, over 3,000 people filed past. This is a slightly later print, but the subject is people viewing Raphael's remains in the Pantheon. The canonical view of Raphael, as I said, is that he was agreeable, well-mannered, and endowed with a sweet, even angelic disposition. This is the profile articulated by the biographer Giorgio Vasari in the mid-16th century. It's a very rich source of information about Raphael's life. And it's the profile of Raphael that's widely encountered in the literature and the artists well into the 20th century and beyond, even into literature of our own time. This biographical construction does have the ring of a trope, which it certainly became in later writings about Raphael. You meet this pleasant, well-mannered young man in every study devoted to his career. But even contemporaries who knew him, like his friend Baldassare Castiglione, author of the Book of the Courtier, here portrayed by Raphael in this sublime portrait in the Louvre, even contemporaries like Castiglione, who knew him well, played with the idea that his saintly nature, that he had a saintly nature, and that it was embodied in his surname, Santi, saints. His parents surely thought he was a saint or an angel, or both, don't we all? But after all, his parents gave him the name of an angel, an archangel, Raphael. And Raphael's father, Giovanni Santi, who was the court artist of the Duke of Urbino, where Raphael was born and raised, Giovanni Santi portrayed Raphael, it's believed, as an angel, a child angel, the detail on your left, standing next to the throne of the Virgin and Child, here at about the age of 8. Yet if we brush away the hyperbole, we find that there are, without a doubt, elements of truth to this characterization. So we're always kind of striding the line between trope and literary conceit and reality. And what's interesting, so interesting about Raphael's biography is how often the two intersect and are mutually inflected. Ample testimony from Raphael's own lifetime speaks to his pleasant disposition, his amiability, his generosity of spirit, and his exemplary manners. And on the right, you're seeing this very familiar self-portrait of Raphael. And on the left, a drawing in the Ashmolean that's believed to be a very early self-portrait by him. He's still really a boy, youthful self-portrait showing him as precisely this kind of sweet and composed child. An early patron and protector of Raphael, the sister of the Duke of Urbino, praised the young artist's gentility in a letter of introduction to the head of the Florentine Republic in 1504. Raphael wanted to go there to study, and she is believed to have written him a letter of introduction in which she described him as, quote, sensible and well-mannered. So again, it's the manners that are emphasized. And I should say this letter, which was known in the 19th century but has since disappeared. In the past, scholars have doubted its authenticity, but most now do accept it as an authentic letter of recommendation introducing Raphael to the ruler of Florence, which was at that moment a republic. Once arrived in Florence, he became the darling of the patrician set. Not only did Raphael receive commissions for several paintings of the Madonna and Child or the Holy Family from wealthy Florentine patrons, show you now the iconic Madonna of the Meadow, but he was also invited to join them for dinner because they enjoyed his company so much. Today, of course, we would all love to have famous artists at our table, but that was absolutely not the norm at this time, certainly not for Florentine artists at this moment, who were still largely regarded as craftsmen and who, with rare exceptions, were not accorded the social standing that would allow them to be an equal at the table of a distinguished, wealthy patrician patron. So again, this idea of his sociability and his winning personality, born of his upbringing at the refined and cultivated aristocratic court of Urbino and as the son of a courtier, comes through. It's a literary trope, but it's sustained by the evidence of his biography. Years later in Rome, at the height of his success, and I'm showing you now just three of the many glorious works of art from Raphael's last years. He was in Rome from 1508 until his death in 1520. Here are some works from the mid-1510s, the height of his career. At this time, the frenetically overworked artist still didn't forget his manners. And this is teased out of an interesting body of correspondence between the agents of the Duke of Ferrara and who are in Rome, and the Duke himself, who has been just begging and wishing and doing anything in his power to get Raphael to paint him a picture. And Raphael keeps promising and promising, but never produces anything. And the stream of correspondence goes on for over 3 years, and it records the relentless and ultimately futile efforts of the Duke, of Alfonso d'Este, to procure a picture that Raphael had long promised him. And we see the Duke telling his agents, just keep pestering him, just follow him around, just implore him. He's promised to give me this picture. And the Duke's agent would always write back, well, I tried to go to his house, but somebody came to the door and said he wasn't there, or I couldn't come in. Initially, Raphael said, I want nothing more than to work for you, and I'll paint this picture, and I can't wait, and there's nothing more important. But that's soon replaced by this clear sense of annoyance and irritation, because his kind of polite platitudes that he obviously had little intention of fulfilling, eventually he just stopped even making these promises and just didn't answer the door, as it were. And his mounting irritation at being stalked by the agents of this Duke really comes across clearly. Whether Alfonso's fulminating admonition to Raphael that he had no business treating a Duke like a peasant was ever delivered, this was the last kind of salvo that the Duke wrote to his agent. Whether Raphael ever received that message is unknown, but he never delivered the picture, and within days of his death, the Duke was trying to get back the down payment that he gave to Raphael. So this chink in his armor of politesse, we're told over and over again how well-mannered and polite and refined he is, but there's a little view into him getting kind of irritated and annoyed and maybe a bit rude. This suggests a more complex character than the two-dimensional depiction of him as unfailingly sweet and sunny. which of course portrays him as the antitype of the dour and kind of acerbic Michelangelo. He's a little more complicated than this kind of two-dimensional portrayal accommodates. But I think without a doubt, a less worshipful and more nuanced portrayal of Raphael is in fact the more historically accurate one. There's no doubt that Raphael, seen here in a late self-portrait with either a friend or a pupil, a lot of discussion about that. There's no doubt, again, that he was genial, polite, sociable, and genuinely fond of and beloved by his many friends and associates. At the same time, he was ambitious, competitive, conspiratorial, and occasionally even ruthless in his single-minded climb to the top. And these are the less attractive aspects of his character. And just kind of expanding out beyond the two-dimensional paper cutout of just a very, polite person making his way through the world. If one or two early anecdotes are to be believed, while he was never a practical joker, Raphael also seems to have had a quick wit and a waggish sense of humor. And I'm going to elaborate on all of these points at slightly greater length. I'm just kind of laying out the richer part of Raphael's personality. Though he was for a long time, and apparently reluctantly, betrothed to the niece of one of the most powerful cardinals of the Curia, this Cardinal Bibbiena, who's very sort of sly and penetrating in his view of the world. Raphael was betrothed to his niece for many years and managed to never get married and yet never incur the cardinal's wrath. He was one of his close patrons and a friend. So he deftly eluded the snares of matrimony himself without incurring the uncle's wrath and went to his grave a bachelor. Though there's an interesting little hint in the documents that he may have had a daughter, and that it's maybe not true, but maybe is true, and it's something that we should try to investigate further. Given his fondness for women, which I'll come back to later, I think it would be actually rather astonishing if he didn't have a daughter. He acquired vast wealth that allowed him to invest in real estate and also to bankroll impecunious friends and acquaintances. He was rich and he kindly lent money. And while he was paid handsomely for his labors, there are hints in the contemporary record of some shady financial dealings. So this is all from the side of Raphael's character and biography that you never will hear much about, but what I want to explore today. On the 500th anniversary of his death, it seems a fitting exercise to sift through documents and other evidence from his lifetime. Everything I'm going to be talking about is called from documents from his life, not later sources, not secondary sources. To sift through these and try to piece together and resurrect this more complicated Raphael, starting with his bones in the Pantheon. The exhumation of Raphael's remains was initiated by the Accademia di San Luca, the Painters' Academy in Rome, which possessed a skull long held to be that of the Prince of Painters, and it was really kind of worshipped there as a sort of relic. Goethe, who saw it, this venerated skull, who saw it in Rome in 1781, described it as a beautifully polished shell. Plaster casts abounded. Goethe himself, in fact, owned one. And I'm showing you here two images. The one, a 19th century photograph, kind of a photo montage on the left, and on the right, a plaster cast of the skull enshrined in the Ducal Palace in Urbino. So there are many of these all around Europe, including one in London, which was subjected to a rigorous phrenological analysis. Phrenology, the study of a skull and a charting of personality and character traits from its configuration. The findings of that investigation were presented in a lecture delivered in 1826 by the president of the Phrenological Society, who charted the relationship between the size and shape of Raphael's cranium and his character and genius. But the object of this inquiry, that skull, like the pseudoscientific methodology itself, was soon discredited. And there were always persistent doubts that the skull was even Raphael's, and those doubts are what in fact precipitated the opening of his tomb in the 19th century. I'm showing you on the left a print of the opening of the tomb, and on the right of his skeleton. Written accounts by several eyewitnesses and drawings and prints of the proceedings, such as these, confirm that his skeleton, skull included, was found perfectly preserved and intact. The opportunity to scrutinize Raphael's remains wasn't wasted, and numerous detailed observations were made at the time, and it's really interesting to read these. There are a lot of different sources at the time describe them. Some offer additional details, but there's a certain common body of information. His skeleton was measured, and so we know from this that he was just under 5 feet 6 inches tall. He had a long neck, delicate arms and chest, and rather strong legs and feet. And his teeth, intact, were handsome. Long hours drawing and painting was the conjectured cause of a distortion that was observed in the bones of his thumb and one of his fingers. And the narrow casket, of the wood casket inside the stone sarcophagus, implied that he had been slender. A great surprise, which apparently shocked observers at the time, was the evidence of an unusually sizable larynx, which indicates that Raphael had a loud voice. I love that detail. So projecting this physically reconstructed Raphael into the setting of his large and noisy workshop, and don't we wish it was the age of photography and we could have pictures of them all at work. But what we do have is this lovely stucco relief and abbreviated glimpse of the workshop laboring away by one of Raphael's great collaborators, an artist Giovanni da Udine, who rediscovered, we're told, the ancient technique of stucco and deployed it to glorious effect in the late decorative campaigns of the workshop. And so here they are hard at work, and we see them. And so here's the workshop, and we can picture, based on this physical evidence, Raphael on his feet, those sturdy legs and feet, projecting with his loud voice over the din as he is directing his industrious corpus of pupils and assistants. So Raphael's affable nature that we've heard so much about did not preclude an ambitious streak, as I've tried to suggest, and now we'll kind of develop that idea. Launching his career in Umbria, not far from his native Urbino, in the cities of Perugia and Città di Castello, he flawlessly emulated and appropriated, would actually not be the wrong description, the manner of Perugino, who was the preeminent local talent and the most famous painter in all of Italy, really, at the time. And I'm showing you on the screen, this is a comparison that anybody who took a Renaissance art class will remember. Comparison of a crucifixion on the left by Perugino and one by Raphael, tiny bit later on the right, where, even as Vasari says, and everyone since, he so closely mastered the manner of Perugino that really couldn't tell them apart. And this comparison absolutely demonstrates that. So he masters the manner of the leading artist of the region, only to promptly shed it upon arriving in Florence in 1504 and processing the artistic innovations of the two towering artists' work there, Raphael, or Leonardo and Michelangelo, of course. And here I'm showing you two Madonnas by Raphael, the two higher up on the screen, comparing them with a relief sculpture of the Madonna and Child by Michelangelo, and Leonardo's Benoit Madonna, where you see Raphael just soaking up the greater dynamism, sense of movement, intimacy, the connection, not just physical, but emotional, between the Madonna and Child. So he processes this, he sheds the manner of Perugino, and within a few years, Perugino, who's mystified, wonders at his own obsolescence. And this is at the moment that Michelangelo, who was none too kind, called him an artistic buffoon for Perugino. And just to make this point again of how quickly Raphael's style evolved, two iterations of the Madonna and Child, the theme he returned to over and over. One on the left still in that early Umbrian mode, sweet, tender, kind of frozen. And on the right, a Madonna from the Roman period, much more animated, dynamic, complex composition, and more psychologically intense connection between, again, the Madonna and Child. In Florence, as I've already said, his geniality opened doors to closed artistic circles. Florence was a very insular and closed artistic community, but he made his way in, and also to wealthy patrons' palaces. for commissions, and also, as I said, for dinner. Here I'm showing you his famous portraits of Agnolo Doni and Maddalena Strozzi, members of the Florentine patrician class. So he makes his way as an outsider, establishes himself surprisingly easily in, as I said, this insular Florence. But interestingly, some years later, one of his Florentine friends, the architect Baccio d'Agnolo, later called Raphael his, quote, capital enemy. When long absent from the city, he parachuted into a competition to design the facade of the Church of San Lorenzo in Florence. The Florentine artists and architects were very, they felt this was a Florentine commission and it was theirs to compete for, and that Raphael at this point was an outsider, so he's arousing this kind of antagonism from his one-time friends and colleagues. Called to Rome by Pope Julius II in 1508, you see that ferocious, feared Pope on the left and Raphael's brilliant portrait in the National Gallery in London. Called to Rome, he acquitted himself so brilliantly in the Stanza della Segnatura, which you see on the right, that the painters who were already at work in the papal apartments, and there were some in the Vatican, were dismissed, a turn of events they certainly could not have welcomed. From that position of privilege, he's now the Pope's painter, and he has just completed this extraordinary first room of the Vatican stanze. From that position of privilege, and aided by the architect Bramante, Raphael made a clandestine visit to the Sistine Chapel, where Michelangelo was then at work on the ceiling, and he did this without Michelangelo's permission, to see the work in progress. For Raphael, the encounter was transformative. And here another familiar comparison from Art History 102, his Isaiah on the right with one of Michelangelo's prophets, and Raphael's own Old Testament prophet is an undisguised paraphrase of Michelangelo's monumental, muscular, weighty, solemn, dynamic, dramatic figures. Raphael's absorbing this all and saying, I can do that. To label it an homage, as it's sometimes been called, is, I think, completely wrong. That means that it's imputing a noble intention to what Raphael did, and that was not at all this opportunistic artist's motivation here. Again, he wanted to see and learn and absorb and propel himself on his own upward career trajectory. So for Raphael, as I said, this was transformative, but for Michelangelo, enraged, it was an unforgivable violation, and the grounds for his bitter, lifelong lament that everything Raphael learned, he learned from him. Michelangelo was older than Raphael, and he died more than 40 years later than Raphael, who, as I said, died prematurely, but till his late old age, he was still lamenting that everything Raphael knew, he learned from him. So from the time of his triumph in the Stanza della Segnatura until his death, Raphael was the Pope's painter. Under Julius's successor, Leo X, the Medici Pope here, the famous portrait in the Uffizi, his remit expanded to encompass architecture. He was named Architect of St. Peter after Bramante died, and antiquities. In some, really every artistic venture of any significance in Rome fell under Raphael's purview. Unrivaled success did not quell his competitive streak, however, or perhaps his competitive streak to help ensure his hegemony. Not sure which way it works, but in 1520, so this is the year of his death, and he's already at the pinnacle, the undisputed pinnacle of the Roman art world. In 1520, a correspondent of Isabella d'Este writes to her and says that Raphael had just thwarted a young Florentine follower of Michelangelo who was trying to find work in Rome. So there's that kind of competitive streak coming out that late in his life. The identity of this unfortunate is unrecorded, but there's no doubt who was the primary trigger of Raphael's competitive impulse. And that, of course, is the painter Sebastiano del Piombo, Michelangelo's disciple and proxy in Rome. Michelangelo himself is in Florence for much of the time, but he's very much kept abreast of what's happening there from his correspondents and friends in Rome. And Sebastiano is, as I said, his artistic proxy. Michelangelo provides drawings for Sebastiano for a number of important commissions, including this one, his marvelous mural of the flagellation in the Church of San Pietro Montorio in Rome, just to give you an idea of this artist's style. Sebastiano's cryptic reference in one of the many letters he wrote to Michelangelo to, quote, the prince of the synagogue, the principe della sinagoga, which has been a much discussed phrase. It may well describe his view of the workshop that Raphael ran as this kind of impenetrable cabal, and Raphael as the head of it. Raphael was the subject of this letter. He's writing about a man who kindly, and in this context, he uses this odd phrase of the principe della sinagoga. I do believe that's the meaning of this, and that it suggests a kind of closed cult that's completely shut off to outsiders. So it was Raphael and his followers, and an artist like Sebastiano was always peering in from the outside and feeling that he could never get a leg up because Raphael had control of everything. When the two artists were pitched in direct competition through the dual commission for a pair of monumental altarpieces, a commission awarded by Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, the cousin of the Pope, Raphael endeavored mightily to derail Sebastiano's efforts. Undeterred, Sebastiano set to work while looking over his shoulder, and again, this is all recounted in contemporary letters and other sources, looking over his shoulder, fearing that Raphael, who hadn't begun his altarpiece, would attempt to spy on him. And when he undertook to have his finished picture, the Raising of Lazarus on the left, framed in Rome before it was sent off to France in order to show it to the greatest advantage, Raphael attempted to intervene and see that the work was framed instead in France. His sabotage campaign in this instance failed, and Sebastiano's painting was framed in Rome. So this is a less attractive, less genial, less well-mannered side of his personality. No such animus, though, colored Raphael's interactions with his assistants and collaborators, and this is another enriching side of his personality that we see him with this kind of genuine love and affection and fondness for his closest disciples, of fondness and affection that really ran to the paternal. And back to this self-portrait, late self-portrait, many scholars now think that the other figure in the picture is none other than his closest, most beloved leading disciple, Giulio Romano. So for purposes of the lecture today, let's say that it is. It certainly shows Raphael placing his hand in a paternal-like gesture, but also a gesture almost of anointing a successor. So we can read a lot into the figural language of this picture. Vasari, the biographer, repeatedly makes the point, this idea of the familial love, paternal filial between Raphael and his pupils. And it's a thread that runs through all of their biographies, the biographies of his principal disciples, the painters Giulio Romano, Gianfrancesco Peni, Perino da Vaga, and the sculptor Lorenzetto, the sculptor who did the Madonna and Child sculpture for Raphael's tomb. We read in all of their biographies by Vasari and in Raphael's own biography that Raphael loved each of them as though they were his own sons. He always uses that term, that language, and they in return loved him with a fierce and filial devotion. So we might think, oh, again, we're encountering a trope, but I believe we're not, and evidence can can sort of document that this really was a kind of family. I'll come back to that briefly in a minute. In terms of his individual relationships with them, wouldn't we love to know more? Did he meddle in their personal lives and tell them that shirt doesn't look very good on you? We don't know anything like that. But he did on at least one occasion, we do know, play matchmaker. According to his friend Castiglione, It was Raphael's wish that Lorenzetto, Raphael's workshop sculptor, Raphael wanted Lorenzetto to marry Julia Romano's sister, Girolamo. I found this an astonishing revelation. It's buried in some correspondence that Raphael, who is so busy and so overworked and so in demand at the fanciest tables in Rome, is arranging a marriage, like between, that would ally two of his disciples in a familial kind of way. And that marriage did finally take place in 1523 after Raphael was dead, but it must have caused this matchmaking master to smile from his grave. And what emerges from this snippet and others is that this workshop, this extraordinary operation, was much more than strictly a business proposition. The workshop really was a tight-knit familia. Raphael's collaborators were part of his and each other's private lives. It was, again, a familia, not just in the sense of family, but familia with all the layered overtones that terminology implies, a closed group, an association, a group of people who are involved in each other's lives and in all kinds of different dealings and activities together. And this is something that I'm working on in my current research and hope to really delve into. I find this network of relationships between Raphael and his pupils and their extended families extremely interesting. And just one of many testimonials to this, going through the documents. In 1515, Raphael's buying a house. He did love to acquire real estate. He's away for some reason, but two of his collaborators from his workshop are sent to represent him in this real estate transaction. It had nothing to do with a picture, with a commission. It's part of his personal life, and they're a part of it too. So, hey, help me out, and off they go. And further testimony of the kind of affection that bound this incredible, talented group of artists is the fact that no fewer than 3 of them named their sons Raphael. So I mentioned real estate, and in fact, real estate consumed no small part of his scarce non-working hours and his increasingly abundant financial resources. By 1517, Raphael owned this palace, sadly destroyed now, but this is the Palazzo Caprini, on what was then the newly fashionable Via Alessandrina, a street near the Vatican. The palace was designed by Bramante, and Raphael acquired it, his second big real estate acquisition in 1517. The following year, in May 1518, he finalized the purchase of a vineyard, a piece of land slightly outside the center of the city near the Colosseum. And on the 24th of March, 1520, so that's only 2 weeks before his unforeseen death, he acquired a parcel of land on another very fashionable, and would become even more so, street in Rome, the Via Giulia, where it has been speculated he intended to build a brand new palace. So this is the 24th of March, 1520. He died on April 6th. So this document gives us an idea that this fever that he died of, which sources say he had for only 8 days, that seems to be about right, because on 24th of March, he's well enough to buy some new land. As for this palace that we think he would have built, he certainly would have designed it himself. And in this context, it was interesting to come across evidence that shows that Raphael had a rather unusual expertise in fireplace and chimneys, and he certainly would have drawn on that when designing his palace had he lived to see it. In addition to owning property, he held a number of salaried official appointments that supplemented his already handsome income. He was on the papal payroll, but he had a lot of appointments that gave him extra wealth, almost like benefices within the church. And with that wealth came social standing and all its appurtenances, including a horse. Not everybody could afford to own a horse. It was a sign of a certain social class. Raphael did. How do we know this? Because his purchase of hay for the horse is documented. And his wealth also fueled his generosity with friends and colleagues. I mentioned that we know he lent money to friends, and there are at least 2 recorded instances of him doing that, to lending money to fellow artists, and both, interestingly, neglected to pay him back. So a lot of testimony about Raphael comes from these letters that Sebastiano wrote to Michelangelo. And if we can believe everything he says, he makes this odd accusation that leads us to conclude that not all of Raphael's financial dealings were above board. This is in a letter of July of 1518 to Michelangelo, and in it, he claims that Raphael was skimming the papal coffers and cheating the Pope of 3 ducats a day by charging him for gold. So Sebastiano, I should hasten to say, was always the grumbling victim when it came to Raphael. So it would be easy to dismiss this rather astonishing accusation as a smear campaign, were it not for Vasari's very strange reference to hidden recesses in the fabric of the papal apartments in the Vatican Palace, constructed on Raphael's orders, where his friends could stash casks and wagons. And I'm showing you now just a group of the rooms in the Vatican where it's unclear, and this has never really been commented on in the literature, it's unclear where we're talking about exactly, but if you look at the floor plan in the lower left, you see the Sala di Costantino, in English, the Hall of Constantine, at a right angle with the Loggia of Raphael. It's probably somewhere in that corner there, or possibly going into the Stanza di Leonardo, but somewhere in here is where these hidden recesses were constructed according to Raphael's orders. The implication here, without doubt, is clandestine favor and a purloined cash, a skimming from the papal store consistent with the padding of accounts that the whistleblowing Sebastiano unmasked. At the very least, this suggests that dubious corner cutting was taking place. And we know it's true because Vasari then says that the structural walls of the palace were weakened by these hollows and that they needed to be shored up. So whether there was nefarious intent or just shortcut taking, it really happened. Exactly what sort of murky dealings with their whiff of privileged impunity are hinted at must be left to the imagination, but the takeaway here is that Raphael was not above skirting the rules. So that gets us a little beyond the sunny, sweet, well-mannered Raphael of lore. And from here, it's no great leap to the cheeky Raphael. I said he had a sense of humor, who mocked 2 German cardinals' ignorance about matters of art. This is in an anecdote that Castiglione recounts, and who also offered a witty retort to a lady who professed to be offended by an erotic detail in the frescoes that Raphael in his workshop painted in Agostino Chigi's villa. This is an anecdote recounted by Paolo Giovio, who knew Raphael and was there. He was kind of like the Zelig of this period. He knew everybody and everyone and was at every major get-together. And if he's telling the story, even if it's a little garbled, I absolutely believe it happened. So the lady professed to be rather astonished and insulted at this erotic detail. And look a little more closely, you see the figure of Mercury. He's not only naked, displaying himself, but then gesturing to a very lewd detail, this famous lewd detail in the garland that reenacts it's a zucchini having sex with a pomegranate. You can kind of see it there, but just in case you miss it, Mercury's pointing at it very unsubtly. And Raphael pointed out to the lady, well, you might claim you take offense at this, but there's another even bigger detail over there that you said you liked. So it's actually rather amusing. So Giulio Romano, he's the member of Raphael's workshop who's credited with being the originator of overtly erotic imagery in Raphael's circle, respectfully waiting until Raphael was dead to go public. I'm showing you one of his images on the screen. This is part of the scandalous series known as the Modi, or ways of doing it, basically. These are 16 engravings that Giulio designed and Marcantonio Raimondi engraved of people having sex. And they caused a huge uproar in Rome when they appeared in 1524. So this is all thought to have happened, this is a few years after Raphael's death. But there are drawings by an artist from Milan who we know hung around and spent a little time in Raphael's workshop in the early 1510s, so while Raphael's still alive, and he produced a sketchbook. It's in the Morgan Library in New York, and there are lots of drawings of things from Raphael's workshop in this sketchbook. And on one of the pages is this scene of figures doing it, as the Modi are translated. that shows that these kind of images were being made in Raphael's workshop, probably just for fun, to laugh and joke at, but while Raphael was alive. So is it just that it wasn't made public in the form of prints until after Raphael's death, and it was going on in his lifetime? I think that seems pretty much to be the case. So whether this was, done with Raphael's approval, whether it is some reflection of Raphael's own behavior, according to Vasari, he did have an insatiable sexual appetite. Vasari refers to this. He was a bit of a prude. He refers to this rather judgmentally and disapprovingly. And it's even been suggested by Madeleine Viljean, who I think is listening today, that these may contain sly references to Raphael's own behavior, that if this was going on in the workshop, his closest pupils would have seen it and known it. And there's the fascinating account, again, by Vasari, relating that Agostino Chigi, one of his most powerful patrons, the richest man in Europe, Raphael was decorating his villa, but he never would come to work because he was so smitten with his mistress that he preferred dallying with her. So the wily Chigi had the mistress transported to the villa and installed there, and that's how he got Raphael to report to work. Do these prints and drawings allude to that aspect of his personality? Maybe. Speaking of the mistress, I'm sure everybody's wondering, I don't want to spend too much time. The portrait on the right is known as the portrait of the Fornarina, which is how Raphael's, the nickname by which Raphael's mistress is known. However, this name only first came into use in the 18th century. And the references to Raphael's mistress from his own lifetime and ensuing centuries do not call her this. We think we know her name, that she's a woman named Margherita Luti, a woman who entered a convent for fallen women shortly after Raphael's death. It's probably her. I believe that, and many, that she's actually the subject of this portrait on the left. And one reason I think this is that you can't see it too well in the image on the screen, but there's a little tendril of a loose hair that's fallen out of her well-groomed bun, and it's literally caressing her face. I mean, this is such an amatory statement. If nothing else, it's certainly a statement of Raphael's great love for women. And I believe the one on the right is more poetic invention, as again, other scholars have suggested that this is a kind of emulation of an ancient trope of female beauty composed by assembling in a composite way the best features of many beautiful women. And people in Raphael's circle love to emulate these ancient conversations and artistic undertakings. And I believe that this is not his mistress. I think it wasn't even finished by him before his death, but that on the right is a poetic invention, and on the left is a real woman, probably a woman who Raphael loved. Assembling these disparate pieces of biographical data results in an image of Raphael that is more well-rounded and psychologically complex than the beatific portrait of past centuries. While he was, again, undoubtedly sweet, well-mannered, kind, and generous, Raphael was also competitive, ambitious, entitled, and perhaps at times even a little unscrupulous. Affable when it mattered because of a patron's stature or a friend's affection, he could become prickly when overwhelmed by the crushing demands placed on him. Hence the promise of Alfonso d'Este's dogged agent to handle him with kid gloves. This is toward the end of that ongoing correspondence. I promise, yes, I'll handle him with kid gloves. I'll get him to do your picture. Though the agent offered in response that Raphael was prone to artistic melancholia, that was his explanation for why he wasn't producing the much wanted picture. This claim of artistic melancholia was a bromide, but the observation in the end wasn't entirely untrue. This is the Raphael captured in his collaborator Marcantonio Raimondi's engraved portrait, withdrawn, brooding, overworked. An untouched panel, palette, and paint pots await. Barricaded in the mantle, a mantle we know he owned because he bequeathed it to his beloved disciple Giulio Romano, who cherished this relic of Raphael enough to make provisions for it in his will. The mantle is mentioned in Giulio Romano's will. the eve of his departure for Rome, when he's putting all his house in order, making sure that if anything happens, everything is accounted for. And the cloak of Raphael is one of the things actually mentioned specifically in his own will. It's extraordinary. It's this portrait of Raphael, I think, that is the most accurate and true. The German Nazarene painter Johann Friedrich Overbeck was among those present in the Pantheon for the opening of Raphael's tomb. He wrote of being so moved that, quote, a shudder came over me when the remains of the honored painter were laid open. And this is, you can kind of shudder with him. This is the sight he would have seen. At the same time, he reflected with melancholy, alas, the spirit of the great artist remains buried deeper than his bones. Raphael's bones remain buried, but 500 years after his death, his spirit, I think, is closer at hand. So thank you, if you're still there.
Thank you. Thank you, Linda, very, very much for a really fascinating talk. And I must say, towards the end, we got into some very titillating territory. In a way, it's a shame we couldn't continue. I'm going to try to keep on time. So we only have a few minutes left for questions. I don't think we'll be able to cover them all. And if not, Linda has very kindly agreed that she will respond separately after the fact, if you will, to them. So if we don't get to your question, we will at a later date. But here's one that will take very little time. How many paintings do we know? How many paintings are extant that Raphael did?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm sorry I can't give you an actual tally, but a lot. Between the frescoes and the altarpieces and the private devotional pictures and the portraits, not to mention his corpus of drawings, which is substantial, many hundreds of drawings, believed to be only 10% of what he probably produced. So a lot, and I'm sorry not to be able to give an exact total.
And you mentioned drawings. We have a question about the drawings. Was there a particular sequence in the way he did his drawings as preparatory for his frescoes? Do we know much about that?
Well, we do, based on the evidence of the drawings themselves, and he did evolve a very elaborate preparatory process using drawings, and that's how he was able to formulate these incredibly epic, operatic, multi-figured, dramatic, yet extraordinarily unified compositions of his Roman frescoes. So he would do a quick first idea sketch, maybe scribbling with pen and ink to sort of formulate what's he thinking. Then he would develop it further in more detailed composition studies. He would do figure drawings of individual figures. He would do studies of the drapery to capture where the light would fall. He would do large composition studies that are really just figuring out where the light and shadow are in the entire composition. And he would then do, in many cases, this is not universal, but often studies, detailed studies of the heads and hands, the two parts of a human figure that were believed to be the most profound conveyors of emotion, and the windows into the soul of the person being depicted. So heads and hands are studied in the greatest detail as kind of a last stage. And then for the big murals, he did full-scale cartoons, life-size, drawings that were as big as the murals themselves, and used to translate the composition onto the wall. So yeah, we do a lot.
Thank you. I'm maybe going to get you only a couple more. And so Raphael died young, as we know, in his 30s. So did Mozart and other geniuses. Where was his career going had he lived a little bit longer?
I love that question. And of course, we can only speculate, but I believe, sharing the view of many others, that in his last years, he was so immersed in the very profoundly intellectual antiquarian world, this recovery of antiquity. There's a contemporary phrase in a letter of Raphael's, finding Rome in Rome, but it was not just like copying a sculpture. It was penetrating the remains of ancient Rome, literary and artistic and archaeological, to recover its entire ethos. And in this effort, he was joined by the leading humanists and intellectuals of the time, and they literally did recover and capture and resurrect the spirit of antiquity. And Raphael's friends in his last years, his circles, he was not the buddy of artists. Almost no artists were his friends. He was the friend of the elite humanists and intellectuals of Rome. And I believe that this is part of his role as sort of surveyor of the Pope's antiquities, and these expeditions he made to places like Tivoli to look at ruins with his learned friends. He was moving in that direction, and his own late architectural projects are recreations of ancient Rome. Ivana Led and other scholar friends written a magnificent book on Raphael's last architectural project, the Villa Madama, which is in every way an evocation of the ancient world as recounted in poetry and architectural ruins and what they understood. So that's where he was going, I think. And I think he assembled this extraordinary core of assistants who were unbelievably capable and conversant in his idiom, and he could trust the painting side of his huge operation to them. They didn't need him hovering over him saying, change that neat. So I differ from some of my colleagues in thinking about how much we see his participation in these late works. That's exactly why he had them, was so they could do that, leaving him free to dream about ancient Rome.
This is IFAR, and someone has sent in a very IFAR kind of question. Are there any acknowledged fakes or forgeries in Raphael's works, and how were they exposed?
There certainly are. And some of them were meant to deceive, and some of them were just because the critical apparatus for being able to discern a real Raphael from an imitation or a copy or a fake has developed over the years. But there are many stories. I'm fascinated in the early collecting history of Raphael because by the time Americans got into the game, the great works were almost all already in European princely or public collections. So the first chapter of Americans collecting, almost all of the works were not right. And so there's a whole waste of former Raphaels that aren't. And so yes, the answer is a resounding yes.
I'm going to end on this one because I myself have been curious about this one. Why in the United States is Raphael not as much of a household name as Michelangelo and Leonardo? We don't have a Charlton Heston playing him in a movie, as we did with Michelangelo, and we don't have a Dan Brown writing a book with his name in the title. Why is that, do you think?
Well, I think this is a perfect full circle closure to how I began. I touched on that a little. I mean, I think for two reasons. One is that of these three, and how extraordinary that they were all there at the same moment in the same place, Raphael's the youngest, and he drew from them. He absorbed their extraordinary artistic innovations and synthesized it into his own way of making art, his own artistic manner. The reverse wasn't true. They were much older, much established. They didn't look to him for inspiration. So it's a bit of a one-way street, but I hasten to say, as I did at the beginning, that's not to diminish Raphael. That was just his way of developing his style. So there is that. But also, I do think it goes back to his personality. I mean, if you were going to rely on the sort of what I've called the two-dimensional portrayal of Raphael as sweet and sunny and happy, and he loved women and they loved him, and he was nice looking and he was friendly and he went to dinner parties. I mean, that doesn't really make for a good Dan Brown book or movie. He had, if we, on the surface, very little of that kind of drama. He wasn't a brooding, moody, poetic genius. He wasn't paranoid. He wasn't hysterical. He wasn't dark and dour. He didn't wear his boots to bed. He didn't keep his money in a chest under his bed because he thought everyone was stealing from him. He just, he was kind of like normative. I'm sorry to use a charged word, but there's not much about his biography as it stands today that makes for a good drama into 20th century. In the 20th century, that's how we want artists to be. In the 19th century, the 18th century, the early 19th century, 18th, 17th century, not at all the case. And that's why, to them, in those days, Raphael was a household word. And even, I'll just end on this, even in the earliest days of America, before there was an America, way before there was a National Gallery, when collecting art was hardly in anyone's mind, the correspondence of the founding fathers, both Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, who have nothing good to say about art and think that a brand new country should never even care about it, but they mention Raphael. So he, even if they didn't know it, they had no idea what a Raphael looked like, he represented an idea and was the kind of paradigm of an artist. And it's really in the 20th century with modern ideas, you know, post-Picasso, ideas about what is the quintessential artistic personality, and Raphael doesn't fit that modern mold, but he defined it up until that moment.
Okay, well, thank you. We're going to have to end here. We went just a few minutes long, but I wanted to include at least a few of the questions. And as I said, Linda Wolk-Simon will respond to the few others that we didn't get to. I want to thank Linda, of course, for a truly wonderful talk. And remind you all that our next evening is going to be on Tuesday, August 18th. Stay tuned. We've recorded this. At some point, we will post it, assuming there are no glitches in the recording. I want to thank AXXL for help with this program. And thank you again for attending and spending some of your time this summer with us. Bye.